First of all, thank you, Anna and Alexandra, for inviting me. It was really by chance that I'm here. I don't know who recommended me, and I was happy to accept this invitation. This is my first time at this huge European Consortium for Political Research conference, and I have to say that I find it not only huge in terms of a big number of participants, but extremely expensive, especially when it comes to the conference fee. Thankfully, for the Australian Macedonian Human Rights Committee, who was generous to cover my conference fee, I'm here. The rest was covered by my faculty. That makes the introduction how hard it is for a scholar coming from a poor and small country to attend big conferences. Thank you all for being here. I mean, the audience. I was also skeptical how many people would be interested in this particular point of Prespa agreement. But I decided to come all this way by car. Just to tell another point of view, another perspective. Why? Because for a year now, or maybe even a little bit more than a year, maybe 14, 15 months, or maybe 2 years time, there is such a huge, I would use a very harsh word, propaganda, from the media, from the political circles, from power centers, who were trying to convince not only the Macedonian citizens, but the wider European public, the world public, that there is final solution of this absurd, silly, historical issue, and so on and so forth. I have to admit before you, and I did so in my very long paper over 40 pages, so whoever is interested, I can email it later to you. So I had to admit in my paper and now before you that I come as a biased, as someone who is subjective, who is part of this story, and this is a very real, ongoing operation in vivo. This is nation rebuilding, or however you call it, something that is going on while we are talking. The implementation of the Prespa agreement will be a long and painful process. The majority of the population, and mostly, of course, ethnic Macedonians, are against the Prespa agreement. They declared their popular will in a referendum. The government disregarded the referendum and went through the parliament on the way to change, to amend the constitution, and to change everything else that followed from the constitution. Of course, the prelude or introduction into this constitutional revision was the process that I call it in its totality Prespa process, on a very unconstitutional, illegal way and against the will of the people concerned. So having all this in mind, it is very hard to speak as someone who is above the question, who is distant, who is completely neutral and fully academic. And there is another point about the role of scholars, of academics in this whole period of this implementation of the Prespa process. Academics were involved in the process very early in the process, at the start. Actually, they were the ones, for example, over 45 very esteemed European scholars published an open letter in The Guardian right after the signing of the Prespa agreement. They supported it in a way it must be honored. I put emphasis on the word must. So the referendum followed, or would be scheduled at some point. But in July last year, these highly esteemed people, colleagues, who are not experts in the Balkans, who are not experts in the Macedonian question, who are philosophers, political scientists, whoever, but they thought that they would be very helpful to give academic legitimacy to a diplomatic deal. To make things even worse, very few people, even today, of those who advocate Prespa agreement, really read the whole deal. It is 20 pages long agreement, very unique, something that has never happened in the history. To have asymmetrical disputes over the name, because you have one country that is member of European Union and NATO, which is much larger in territory, in military strength, in economic strength, despite the problems that Greece has, obviously. In any case, it is the stronger part in the story. And you have this tiny little country that is accused for being theft of history, of being irredentist, to represent security threat to a NATO member state, and to have to oblige to the demands from the neighbor, only to please the neighbor in order to open the perspectives for integration in NATO and European Union. So the dispute was asymmetrical from the start, and obviously the Prespa agreement, the result of this process, is asymmetrical, because there is nothing that Greece is really supposed to give up or to change or to sacrifice. Actually, the Macedonian side is the one who had, which it sounds really ridiculous at some point, to write down that indeed Alexander is of Greek origin, that whole history that we heard something about from Anna belongs to a nation. And actually that is a certificate for the continuity myth of the Greek nation. While the Macedonian nation, even Anna made that reference a couple of times in her presentation, comes from Tito. Tito is mentioned, like Tito invented Macedonians. No, Macedonians are artificial construction as any nation in the world. The Greeks are artificial construction, the Bulgarians, Polish people as well. So my position is that we cannot divide nations like who is younger or older, so it is a historical process. Some nations were made earlier in the history, some had more difficult path, but there are traces and historical signs of self-awareness. In historical terms, Macedonians, yes, they were under the pressure of this neighboring, mostly religious propaganda to make them good Bulgarians or good Serbs or good even Greeks. But under such pressure, there was a policy, and now we speak of theory. Andrew Rossos actually wrote a very good book about that, and he mentioned that concept of nashism. When people threatened by armed guards were asked, "Who are you?" they were afraid to say, "I am Macedonian," but they would rather use, "We are ours, we are from here, we are locals." We are nashism. To make things, even this historical cycle to come today, it is exactly what's going on today in Macedonia. Because the majority of the population doesn't want to even mention the word North Macedonia, Severna Macedonia. I refuse to use that name. I only use it in my paper as a reference, but keeping in mind, and I have a legal education apart from being a political scientist, I know that Prespa agreement violated the UN Charter, the UN Covenant on Political and Civil Rights, a vast range of European conventions on human rights. The constitutional process was wrong from the beginning, as I said. So the foreign minister did not have right to sign such an agreement. The Prespa agreement is not ratified according to the Macedonian law. The constitutional review was made under scandalous conditions. There was no parliamentary debate. Parliamentarians were bribed. Some of them were released from jail because they were under charges for some previous crimes from the previous regime or the infamous events of 27th of April. I don't know how much are you familiar with that. Nevertheless, the point is that Zoran Zaev, as a prime minister, could not have two-thirds majority in the parliament, so he had to use any means necessary. And that was blessed by the European Union, by the European Commissioner Johannes Hahn, who publicly said and delivered a message: please do whatever it takes, even using your Balkan way. I'm quoting that. He said that publicly, and I have a reference for that. So yes, the Balkan politicians used the Balkan way, and they actually bribed, intimidated, or released from jail, or made a deal with these 8 parliamentarians from VMRO, which is not far radical right party. It is a conservative right, but it's not a fascist party. But these 8 guys had a personal interest to join the majority and help change the constitution. Under such circumstances, it is very, very hard to get legitimacy of the Prespa process, to make me or other people accept the name as something that, okay, maybe it is painful, maybe it is wrong, but it will open the gates of the heaven. Apart from the truth that European Union is far from heaven, especially nowadays, NATO is not an organization that would resolve the essential problems of this weak state, and Macedonia is weak state, poor state, and doesn't need really, and won't change if in, I don't know, some months or a year from now join a military alliance. I simply can't see what the results would be. I don't know how much time I have. 2-3 minutes, okay, just to conclude.
3 minutes.
The point is, I tried in I have to repeat a very long paper, and my apologies for anybody from the panel who had to go through it. I tried to show that the Prespa process is self-fulfilling prophecy. In order to avoid some bad consequences, some external actors, together with the internal political elite, tried to push something in a way that is going to cause exactly the prophecy they are trying to avoid. So my prognosis is very bad. Second, the title of my paper, or subtitle, is about collateral damages. If we speak about Europeanization of Macedonia or North Macedonia, you can't Europeanize a country with changing a label. You can't make a vinegar wine simply by putting a new label on the bottle. The essence of the state, a weak state, with no institutions, with no rule of law. Actually, rule of law was the first collateral damage of the Prespa process. So now, when the American ambassador, a new one, just arrived, gives a message to the public, this is a high time to start implementing rule of law. That sounds ironical, you know, because whole year before, they were just turning their blind eye to the process of obvious, flagrant violation of rule of law, because there was no rule of law for better good, for higher good. So let's forget about rule of law and then we will be back. No, it doesn't work that way. What happened actually is that Zoran Zaev, who together with Tsipras were nominated for Nobel Peace Prize, like someone who doesn't know anything about the name dispute would believe that these two nations were fighting and bloodshedding and I don't know what. No, Macedonians are going to Greece. I was in Greece some weeks ago and I intend to go after the conference again. So there is no problem of that kind. It is a problem on an elite level of some other considerations and geopolitical consideration actually. Right now, it is important not for European Union but for NATO to have Macedonia in rather than out because of the changed geopolitical environment. Zoran Zaev, who probably seriously believes that he deserves Nobel Peace Prize, got carte blanche to do whatever he or his government wants. Currently, we are shaken as a country by a huge political scandal involving the special prosecutor, the judges, the prime minister. So everything is in much worse shape than a year ago. So if last year people were through propaganda persuaded that Prespa agreement would mean European prospects and everything else, now when the project fails actually in terms of Europeanization, NATO is probably already mission accomplished, but not European Union. We are further away from Copenhagen criteria than ever before. So just like my final sentence, I mentioned that in the paper, it is actually my old prognosis, but now I think it rings even more true, that Macedonia's way to European Union reminds on Fitzgerald's story of Benjamin Button, the curious case of Benjamin Button. Further it goes, it gets younger in terms of democracy, European values, or whatever you consider important for a democratic state. So I'm looking forward to the next presentation and will be open for any questions later. Thank you.